With stars dancing in front of my eyes, I staggered from the dark cellar into brilliant sunshine. A final burst of summery sun lit a landscape of total devastation. Everywhere, columns of smoke were climbing into the sky. Groups of slightly wounded men stood staring and talking, visibly stricken with desperation and horror. One of them told me we were surrounded. This terrible news was almost as destructive as the bombardment. A sense of every man for himself had begun to spread, and our officers needed all the severity they could muster to prevent a hopeless rout. Still, another day passed as I began to slowly recover, but my head swam, like the head of a convalescent who had gotten up too quickly. I stayed huddled in a corner as long as I could, gleaning fragments of news from the rest of the city. Surrounded. Dangerous situation. The Russians have already reached. We're trapped. The Luftwaffe is coming. But instead of our planes, we heard yaks and his throbbing overhead and the pale blue sky, and torrents of Russian bombs shaking what was left of the town. What exactly was happening? Almost no one really knew. I remember the non-coms coming to comb the infirmary. A fellow had to be missing a foot, at least, to be able to stay behind. I was among those who could still be used, and was led back with several bandaged companions to a zone near the front of the fighting. In a vast space, bordered by roofless houses, a new group was hastily organized. Among the 5 or 6 officers present, I immediately recognized Herr Hauptmann Visreidau. From nearby to the northeast, the thunder of Stalin's organs drowned our voices and provoked a wave of panic, which was difficult to control. I was still very sick. My mouth tasted sour, and I felt as if my thin, faltering body was supported only by my boots and my filthy clothes. Visreidau began to speak, raising his voice to make himself heard above the noise of the guns. He would probably have preferred to give us a more detailed explanation, but the continuous uproar, the pressure of time, and the risk of Russian planes suddenly diving at our 3 companies drawn up in the square forced him to be brief. Kameraden, we're surrounded. The entire division has been surrounded. We already knew it, but hearing that officially made us horribly afraid. A situation officially acknowledged to be dangerous by the staff must be very serious indeed. In the near distance, through the sound of explosions, we could hear the howl of Russian rockets. Both the earth and sky were filled with roaring noise, as if to emphasize the desperation of Captain Visreidau's announcement. We still have one hope, he went on, a swift and brutal breakthrough by all our forces pressing at a single point. This point must be to the west, and we shall engage all our units at once. The success of this attempt depends on the courage of every one of us. There will only be one attempt, and it must be successful. There's some strong infantry units which will be going into action to help us on the other side of the Russian rain. If each one of us performs his duty, I feel confident that we shall break out of the Bolshevik noose. I know the qualities of the German soldier. Visreidau saluted and requested us to get ready. Our companies were directed to the points from which they were to press our final assault. There were many wounded men among us, more deserving of a warm bed than of further battles, and fellows like me who were sick. The vast majority were utterly exhausted, staring with infinite weariness from glittering, feverish eyes. These were the troops Visreidau had been exhorting to an excess of courage, valiant German soldiers who looked more like worn-out stock, ready for the slaughterhouse. And yet, we had to attack or die. At that time, there was no question of captivity. As always, after a hard knock, we rediscovered a kind of unity and seemed to be held together by tighter bonds. What provoked the sentiments of generosity which brought out the last cigarettes, or the chocolates so rare they were usually devoured in secret, a fraction at a time, inciting all the scum to fake friendship leading the non-coms, who had probably been mixed up with every kind of dirt in civilian life, to pat a suspected possessor on the shoulder and talk of trust and faith, when they were really hinting for a bite, just like everyone else. Where did they come from, precisely, when no one could use them? I was sick of the whole thing. My stomach was turning over, and I felt cold. Straight ahead, to the west, the smoke had climbed so high it blotted out the sun, and the distant horizon was rained with fire. What substance could be feeding such a huge conflagration? Companies of men, black with dust and soot, were pouring back on the run. It seemed that our first contact with the Russians had not been in our favor. The retreating troops left a certain number of wounded with us, but no one knew what to do with them. The medical teams, which at best were inadequate, had already packed up and gone, or were about to leave. The wounded men were left lying in the street where they had been put down, trying to stanch the flood of their own blood, which was often pouring from several wounds at once. Everyone tried to help as much as possible, but we were capable only of ludicrous gestures. The most extraordinary scenes unfolded in front of our incredulous eyes. As we were sponging off a fellow who passed out, a fat fellow with a smashed knee, he was making too much noise and I couldn't stand it. Give me someone who's knocked out any time. For the moment, our stretch of cleared street was not under bombardment. The battle was raging directly ahead, as well as to the northwest and southwest. Directly to the north, the Russian artillery was raking over the ruins like a monstrous plow. However, as a few of the retreating men huddled beside us, trying to catch their breaths, the Russian fire shifted and began to sweep through our position like a giant scythe. Our officers' orders were drowned by the shouts of the men and the uproar of a frantic stampede for shelter. Our jostling and cries for help and screams of panic were finally obliterated by explosions. Everyone who was able to had run off the street. The slightest protuberance offered some hope of survival, as a wall of fire passed over 2,000 troops concentrated on that spot. The wounded, abandoned in the open, lay writhing in the dust. Through the uproar, we could hear the sound of disarticulated bodies falling back to the ground in broken pieces. As at Belgorod, the earth shook, and everything trembled and grew dim as the whole landscape suddenly became mobile. The filthy hands of ill and wounded men resigned to death scratched the ground for one last time, and the lying faces of veterans who believed they had already seen everything were transformed by desperate, imploring panic. Quite near us, behind a heap of tiles, a Russian shell scored a bullseye, exploding in the midst of 11 men who had huddled together like children caught in a sudden rain. The Russian shell landed in the precise center of their trembling group, mixing flesh and bones and tiles in a torrent of blood. Chance, which continued to favor me, had driven me along with 3 companions to the shelter of a staircase in a roofless house. The building was hit on all sides during the bombardment, and the cellar filled with broken beams and other debris. However, thanks to our extraordinary helmets, our heads survived intact. When the thunder stopped for a moment and we heard the screams of the newly wounded, we looked outside. The horror of what we saw was so overwhelming that we fell back, as if paralyzed, onto the shaky stairs. "God help us," someone shouted. "There's nothing but blood." "We've got to get away from here," screamed another voice in a tone close to madness. He ran outside and we followed him. The air was filled with bestial cries. Everyone who had been lucky enough to survive was falling back to the west, where, as always, safety lay. And now the front, and the gap through which we would try to escape. Anyone who could still stand was helped. The wounded grabbed at the men running past. 2 haggard soldiers in front of me were dragging a third man through the dust, probably a friend who was nearly dead. How long had they pulled him along like that? And how long would it take them to dump him? I could no longer tell how long our stampede lasted. Through the anonymous ruins and thick smoke and roaring guns, the Russians were firing at us from all sides, at close range with 50-millimeter guns. We staggered on, carrying the wounded as best we could. In complete disorder, we came to a railroad track stringed with the burnt-out wreckage of a train and a few Russian corpses. We trampled over them with a kind of fierce delight, taking our revenge for their artillery and their 50-millimeter fire. The tracks ran through a kind of trench. We galloped down it, passing a second train as still and broken as the first. Some of our vehicles seemed to be parked there too, surrounded by a crowd of soldiers and several Panzermänner. We ran right into a group of officers. Des Riedau, who had stayed with us throughout, was one of them. We were given a few minutes' rest, and everyone dropped where he stood. To the southwest, the den seemed to have increased tenfold and made my head swim. Then we received a fresh blow. Thus Riedau and two of his aides ran through the groups of exhausted men. "Get up, get moving, we've got to push on now. The division has broken through. If you don't hurry, we'll be caught in the trap. So get up, we're the last ones left." Already, men half dead with exhaustion were staggering to their feet. The non-coms tapped on their shoulders of the stronger men who were trying to help the wounded comrades they had carried out of town and told them not to bother anymore. "Don't load yourself with anyone who can't walk. You'll need all the strength you've got just to make it yourself." And so we were forced to abandon a great many men to an almost inconceivably horrible fate. Despite their desperate pleas for help, half paralyzed by terror and fear, men who had almost lost all of their blood managed to get up and even hide their pain so that they would be allowed to walk beside the healthy. The heroism, pathos, and determination of our breakout exceeds by far my powers of description. Men who had always been cowards became heroes despite themselves. A great many managed to cover barely half the distance. We fought our way through the fires of hell, losing almost half of our remaining men, as we pushed for more than 9 hours, from shell hole to shell hole, past burnt-out tanks and piles of hundreds of shriveled corpses. You, who perhaps will someday read these lines, may also remember that one evening in the summer of 1943, the bulletins announced that German troops caught in the Kondatop had managed to break out of a Russian trap. This was true. Of course, the price was never mentioned, because it didn't matter. For you, the day of deliverance was coming. Over the next few weeks, our arduous journey continued as we tried to reach the Dnieper River. During our long and painful retreat to the river and our endless wait, our thoughts had crystallized around this idea, and actually stepping onto the west bank seemed like the end of our misfortune. Reorganization, plainclothes leave, and the assurance that we had not been beaten awaited us. What awaited us on the other side of the river, where a secure and organized German position was still maintained, was not as comforting as we had hoped. The officers and soldiers were waiting to direct us were not particularly agreeable, and the military police, with their badges glistening dankly in the fog, were downright unpleasant. I was eventually taken, along with 19 others, to a building that had its own generator and was brightly lit. There were non-coms and a lieutenant in our group. Our state of extreme filth suddenly made our feet awkward. Military men of all ranks and military police were sitting facing us behind a row of long tables. An Obergefreiter came up to us, yelling as in the old days at training camp. He told us to get over to the tables to be screened. We should be ready to produce on demand the papers and equipment entrusted to us by the Army. This reception only increased our sense of astonished unease. "First, your documents," an NP shouted across the table. The lieutenant, who's directly ahead of me in the line, was being interrogated. "Where is your unit, Lieutenant?" Annihilated, missing or dead. We had a hard time. The MP said nothing to this, but went on leafing through the lieutenant's papers. Did you leave your men, or were they killed? The lieutenant hesitated for a moment. We were all watching in frozen silence. Is this a court-martial? The lieutenant's voice was exasperated. You must answer my questions, Herr Lieutenant. Where is your unit? The lieutenant felt caught in a trap, as did we all. Very few of us could have answered that question with any precision. He tried to explain, but there's never any point in explaining to an NP. Their powers of comprehension are always limited to the form they wish to fill. Further, it appeared that the lieutenant was missing a great many things. This fact obsessed the interrogator. It didn't matter that this man in front of him was effecting a miracle simply by staying on his feet. It had lost at least 30 pounds since entering the army. The MP only noted that the Zeiss field glasses, which are a part of an officer's equipment, were missing. Also missing were a mat case and the section telephone for which the lieutenant was responsible. In fact, the lieutenant, who had managed to save only his life, was missing far too many things. The army did not distribute its papers and equipment only to have them scattered and lost. A German soldier is expected to die rather than indulge in carelessness with army property. The careless lieutenant was assigned to a penal battalion, and 3 grades were stripped from his rank. At that, he could think himself lucky. The lieutenant's eyes were wild as he seemed to be fighting for breath. He was a pitiful and terrifying sight. 2 soldiers dragged him off to the right, toward a group of broken men who had been dealt with in the same way. Then it was my turn. I felt stiff with fright. I pulled my crumpled documents from an inside pocket. The MP rifled through them, throwing me a reproving look. His bad temper seemed to soften somewhat at the sight of my apprehensive, mortified face, and he continued his inventory in silence. Fortunately, I had been able to reintegrate with my unit and had saved a scrap of white cardboard which stated that I had left the infirmary to take part in an attack. My head was swimming, and I thought I was going to faint. Then the MP read off a list of articles which ordinary soldiers like myself were supposed to carry at all times. The words rolled off his tongue, but I didn't catch them quickly enough, and didn't immediately produce the items still in my possession. The MP then treated me to a certain German word, which I was hearing for the first time. It appeared I was missing 4 items, including that gas mask I had deliberately abandoned. My paybook was passed from hand to hand to be inspected and stamped. In my panic, I made an idiotic move. Hoping to gain favor, I produced 9 unused cartridges from my cartridge belt. You were retreating? Why didn't you try to defend yourself? Why didn't you fight? He shouted. We were ordered to retreat, Herr Unteroffizier. He roared, what kind of an army runs without shooting? My paybook came down the line. My interrogator grabbed it and rifled the pages for a moment. His eyes traveled from the filthy, tattered page to my face. I followed the movement of his lips, which might be about to assign me a penal battalion, to the life of a prisoner, to 4 positions, mine-clearing, infrequent leaves, always confined to camp, so that the word liberty lost all meaning, and the cancellation of mail. I held back my tears with difficulty. Finally, the MP's rigid fingers handed back my liberty. I had not been assigned to a penal battalion, but my emotion overwhelmed me anyway. As I picked up my pack, I sobbed convulsively, unable to stop. A fellow beside me was doing the same. The crowd of men, still waiting, stared at me in astonishment. Like a miserable tramp, I ran past the line of tables and left by a door opposite the one we had entered by. I felt that I had disgraced myself. However, despite the slap in the face I had just received from my grateful country, I could still count myself lucky.